The first sign wasn't loud or obvious. It came on a quiet Thursday evening when the scent of my husband's cologne clung to a silk scarf that wasn't mine. I had found it draped carelessly over the back seat of his car, pale lavender, with a faint perfume I didn't recognize. For a moment, I told myself it must have belonged to Lily's friend, maybe left behind during one of their carpools. But the way it was folded, the way it smelled, told me otherwise. I sat there in the driver's seat with my fingers curled around the fabric, my chest tightening, as though my lungs couldn't decide whether to hold air or collapse. That scarf, so delicate and perfumed, was the crack in the glass of my perfect life. Before I go further, let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more true family stories of betrayal and justice. My name is Elena, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had built something solid, a life with structure and meaning. I met Mark when I was 24, just starting out as a school counselor, while he was already climbing through the sales world. He carried himself with a kind of certainty that drew me in, promising adventure and protection all at once. We married within 2 years, bought a brick colonial on the edge of town, and for a long time, I believed we had done everything right. We had Lily, our bright, outspoken daughter, and I poured myself into both my career and motherhood. From the outside, we looked like any other family who had managed to balance work, home, and love. Mark thrived in the world of client dinners, late meetings, and constant travel. I had learned to accept his busy schedule, convincing myself it was the price of stability. He brought in the income that kept our home comfortable, while I held steady as the anchor, the one who made sure bills were paid, meals were on the table, and Lily never felt neglected. It wasn't glamorous, but I felt proud of what we'd built. Even when Mark's phone buzzed late at night, or when I smelled wine on his breath after another so-called client outing, I brushed it off. We were still the couple who hosted backyard cookouts, who posed for photos at Christmas, who neighbors admired for seeming so put together. Yet beneath that polished surface, subtle shadows had been forming. There was Tessa, my closest friend since college, who had slipped so seamlessly into our family gatherings that Lily called her Aunt Tessa. She planned events for half the town, her life always glittering with parties and champagne toasts. And Mark often praised her energy. I told myself it was harmless the way his eyes lingered a moment too long, the way her laugh seemed softer when directed at him. After all, she was my friend, and loyalty was the foundation I built my world upon. Still, as I sat in the car that evening with the lavender scarf burning like evidence in my hands, memories rushed back, the last-minute cancellations, the stories that didn't add up, the way Tessa had once brushed off my question about where she had been on a weekend she was too busy to meet. Pieces of a puzzle I hadn't wanted to solve suddenly demanded my attention. I folded the scarf carefully, sliding it into my purse, like a secret too dangerous to leave behind. The house lights glowed warm when I pulled into the driveway, Lily's laughter echoing faintly through the kitchen window. For her sake, I smiled as I stepped inside, kissing her on the forehead, keeping my voice steady as though nothing had shifted inside me. But as Mark greeted me with his usual charm, wrapping an arm around my waist, I felt the weight of that scarf pressing against my side like a stone in my pocket. And in that moment, though, he smiled and spoke as though everything was ordinary. I knew the surface harmony was beginning to fracture. The life I thought was stable was about to unravel in ways I had only feared in restless dreams. What I didn't know then was just how far the betrayal reached, or how much strength I would need to face it. That lavender scarf never left my mind. It sat at the bottom of my purse like a secret I could not speak aloud, but every time I brushed against it, the truth pulsed stronger. I told myself to wait, to observe before accusing, but small signs kept appearing, subtle at first, then sharper, impossible to ignore. The scarf had opened my eyes, and once open, they would not close again. Mark's phone became the next clue. He guarded it more than usual, keeping it face down at dinner, slipping it into his pocket the moment a notification buzzed. When I reached across the counter one morning to silence the alarm, his hand closed over mine faster than I expected. His laugh was casual, too quick, as though nothing was unusual. "I've got it," he said, his thumb locking the screen before I could glimpse more than a faint purple glow from a message bubble. My stomach turned. Then there were the late evenings that stretched into nights. Mark always had client dinners, events, or travel, and I had accepted them for years without suspicion. But suddenly, his explanations carried a rehearsed quality. He would say, "It's just a long dinner with the regional team, or I'll be home after dessert yet." He returned after midnight with his tie loosened and the faint trace of perfume clinging to his collar. Not mine, not Lily's, not any, I recognized. A scent of powder and jasmine that felt foreign in my home. Lily noticed it too, though she didn't understand. One Saturday, she curled beside me on the couch with her laptop balanced on her knees. Mark had promised to take her driving that morning, but had called last minute saying a meeting had come up. She didn't complain, but her shoulders slumped. "It's fine," she said, her eyes fixed on the screen. "I'll just practice next week." My heart squeezed at the quiet disappointment in her voice. She deserved a father who kept his word, not one who hid behind excuses. And then came the whispers I never wanted to hear. It was at a neighborhood barbecue, laughter spilling over the fence and children racing across the lawn when I caught the hushed tones of two women behind me. "That's Elena, isn't it?" one murmured. "I heard her husband has been spending a lot of time with that Grant woman." "You know, the party planner." My chest tightened at the name. Tessa, my closest friend. I turned quickly, forcing a smile, as though I hadn't heard, as though the words hadn't sliced through me. But inside, the ground shifted beneath my feet. The signs were stacking up: lavender fabric, hidden phones, broken promises, and now gossip spoken in low voices when they thought I was too far to hear. My instinct told me to confront him, to demand answers, but another part of me held back. I wanted more than excuses. I wanted the truth so undeniable that no twist of words could erase it. So I watched. I noticed the way he checked his reflection twice before leaving for certain meetings, smoothing his hair and adjusting his cufflinks as though stepping into more than a business dinner. I caught the way his voice softened on the phone tone, warmer than when he spoke with colleagues. And I couldn't ignore that Tessa's name surfaced too often, always tied to an event, always as a convenient explanation for another absence. One evening, as Lily sat at the kitchen island finishing homework, I set down my pen and listened to Mark's voice in the next room. He was on the phone, speaking in a low, almost playful tone I hadn't heard directed at me in years. His laugh drifted through the doorway, warm and intimate, and though he ended with, "Talk to you soon," Tess, the sound of her name landed like glass breaking inside me. I stepped into the doorway, my hands trembling, but he only looked up with that polished smile. "Just business," he said smoothly, slipping the phone into his pocket. I nodded, though my throat burned with words I couldn't speak, not yet. I had no proof, but the way my heart knew, the way the scarf still pressed like evidence against my side. That night, I lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing as he slept. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that should bring peace, but instead, it pressed heavy on my chest. I stared at the ceiling, remembering every laugh Tessa and I had shared, every secret exchanged over coffee, every time I had trusted her with my family. And now, the possibility that she and Mark were tangled together in a web of betrayal left me cold. The next morning, as I packed Lily's lunch, I watched Mark leave with his briefcase in hand, his stride confident, his phone already to his ear. The door clicked shut behind him, and for the first time in years, I felt like a stranger in my own kitchen. The foundation I thought we had built was cracking, and I could no longer ignore the signs. I knew then that my waiting had reached its end. I needed answers, and I needed them soon. Because the longer I stayed silent, the more their betrayal grew in the shadows. And deep down, I feared that once the truth emerged, my life would never look the same again. Nights became the hardest. I would lie beside Mark in our bed, his back turned toward me, his breathing steady and deep, while my own eyes stayed open, fixed on the shadows stretching across the ceiling. The scarf, the perfume, the whispers at the barbecue, they circled in my mind like restless birds. I tried to swallow them down, to convince myself I was imagining patterns where none existed, but the knot in my chest only grew heavier. In the quiet hours when the world felt suspended, I wondered when my marriage had shifted from a sanctuary into something I feared. During the day, I wore a mask of composure. At school, I listened to my students' worries with calm patience, nodding as they poured out struggles with friendships, grades, and family. I knew how to soothe, how to guide them toward steadier ground, yet I felt powerless in my own life. At home, I moved through the motions of dinner, laundry, and bills, careful not to let Lily see the unease that threatened to spill from me. She was 17, on the cusp of adulthood, and I didn't want her high school years clouded by suspicion or the sound of her parents arguing behind closed doors. Still, small cracks showed. One evening, while chopping vegetables, I found my hand trembling so badly the knife slipped and nicked my finger. The sting was sharp, but sharper still was Lily's gaze as she rushed to grab a bandage. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, her brows knitted in concern. I forced a smile, brushing it off as clumsiness, but she lingered a little longer than usual, as if she sensed something deeper I refused to say aloud. I avoided Tessa, though she called twice about meeting for coffee. Each time, I let her message sit unanswered until she gave up, her cheerful voice on voicemail suddenly sounding hollow. I couldn't bear to face her, not while the scent of her perfume haunted my home. It was easier to pull away quietly, to let silence build between us, than to risk hearing lies spoken with a smile I once trusted. Mark carried on as though nothing had changed. He whistled in the mornings while pouring his coffee, kissed my cheek on his way out the door, and asked routine questions about Lily's classes. But I noticed the way his eyes avoided mine, sliding past me as if direct contact might give something away. He had always been confident, sometimes even careless, but now there was a stiffness in his posture when he thought I wasn't watching. The space between us stretched wider each day, filled with words unspoken and truths buried. The quiet took its toll. My sleep grew shallow, broken by long hours of staring into darkness. My appetite shrank until I found myself pushing food around my plate, unable to swallow more than a few bites. Even music in the car felt unbearable. The lyrics of love songs stung, while the cheer of upbeat melodies felt cruel. I drove in silence, my thoughts too loud to drown out. One night, unable to bear the weight pressing down on me, I sat at the kitchen table long after Lily had gone to bed. The clock ticked past midnight. The refrigerator hummed softly, and I pressed my palms against the cool wood of the table, grounding myself. Tears slipped silently down my cheeks, leaving salt stains on my lips. I hated crying, alone, hated the weakness it seemed to reveal. But in that moment, the sorrow felt too heavy to contain. I remembered my parents' marriage, steady, ordinary, full of small kindnesses, like my father filling my mother's gas tank before work. or my mother setting aside his favorite slice of pie. I had grown up believing love meant constancy, not perfection, but reliability, the assurance of someone who would not waver. And now, sitting alone in the dim light of my kitchen, I wondered if I had mistaken performance for devotion, mistaking Mark's charm and gestures for something deeper than they truly were. When he came home late again, his footsteps heavy on the stairs, I wiped my face quickly and feigned sleep. I could feel him pause in the doorway, his presence filling the room, but he didn't touch me or speak. Instead, he set his phone on the nightstand and climbed into bed, turning away as though our bodies no longer shared the same space. I lay rigid, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, each exhale widening the gulf between us. The next morning, I stood at the bathroom sink, toothbrush in hand, studying my reflection. The woman staring back at me looked older than her years. The skin beneath her eyes bruised with exhaustion, the corners of her mouth pulled down by grief. I barely recognized myself. For years, I had counseled others to know their worth, to set boundaries, to demand respect. Yet here I was, living quietly beneath suspicion and doubt, afraid to name what I already knew. It wasn't just the betrayal that pained me. It was the silence I carried, the way I hid my fears from Lily, from my colleagues, even from myself. I had built my life on the belief that honesty and care could hold a family together, but honesty from me alone was not enough. Trust required both sides, and Mark had already let it slip through his hands. I folded a towel, slowly setting it on the linen shelf, and felt something shift inside me. The sorrow hadn't lessened, but beneath it, a small ember of resolve began to glow. I could not live forever in this half-light, pretending not to see what was before me. Soon, I would need to face the truth directly, no matter how painful. For now, I gathered my strength quietly, moving through my days with care, storing each doubt and each tear as if collecting proof for myself. But deep down, I knew the silence could not last forever. A reckoning was coming, and I would no longer be able to pretend. The morning I decided I could no longer ignore the truth was gray and wet, the kind of day where clouds pressed low over the neighborhood roofs. Rain tapped softly against the kitchen window as I stood with my coffee watching the water slide down the glass. Mark had left early, his excuse another meeting out of town, though I had long stopped believing those words. The silence in the house felt different that morning, heavier, more final. Something inside me shifted, and I knew I had reached the point where denial could no longer protect me. I spent the afternoon clearing out the hall closet, though it wasn't clutter that drove me. I needed motion, something to ground the storm inside my chest. As I folded coats and stacked shoes, my hands trembled with restless energy. Each fabric square I touched, each box I set aside, only seemed to echo what I already knew: our life was unraveling. The scarf I had tucked deep into my purse weeks earlier came to mind, and I pulled it out again. Its lavender scent had faded, but it still carried the weight of betrayal. Holding it in my hands, I realized it was more than fabric. It was proof that something sacred had been broken. That evening, Lily asked if we could order pizza and watch a movie. Her request was simple, innocent, but my heart tightened. I sat with her on the couch, pretending to laugh at the comedy she chose, but every time my eyes drifted toward the empty chair, where Mark should have been, I felt the ache of what she was missing. Lily leaned her head against my shoulder halfway through the film, and I stroked her hair silently, promising her that she would not be left in the dark much longer. Later that night, after she had gone upstairs, I sat alone in the living room with only the lamplight spilling across the rug. My thoughts turned to Tessa, the woman who had once stood beside me at every school fundraiser, who had held Lily as a baby, who had known my secrets since college. I couldn't understand how she could look me in the eye and still smile if she was sharing what should have been mine alone. The weight of her betrayal burned deeper than Mark's because she had crossed not just trust, but friendship. I knew I couldn't continue in silence. The decision settled over me like a heavy cloak, uncomfortable yet steady. I needed to see the truth for myself, not hints or whispers, but undeniable evidence. That resolve carried me through the following days, even as Mark's excuses grew bolder. He returned late Thursday with a story about traffic and a missing flight connection. He kissed my cheek, his voice smooth and practiced, but I caught a faint trace of the same perfume I had smelled weeks earlier. He didn't notice when I closed my eyes, briefly holding myself still, so I wouldn't recoil. The next day, I told my colleague I needed to leave work early. My heart pounded as I drove toward the city, following the mental map I knew from Tessa's frequent updates about her events. She had mentioned a hotel ballroom she was decorating for a charity gala. I parked across the street, rain spattering against the windshield, and waited. The minutes stretched long, each one filled with doubt and dread. Then I saw them. Mark stepping from a cab, his hand resting lightly at Tessa's back as they entered the glass doors together. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My hands gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. They moved with the ease of people who had done this before. His head bent close to hers as they spoke. It wasn't a mistake or a misunderstanding or a single weak moment. It was real, and it was happening right in front of me. I didn't storm across the street or throw open the doors. Instead, I sat frozen, watching the truth unfold with painful clarity. A part of me had hoped I was wrong, that suspicion was poisoning my thoughts. But now, the curtain had lifted. The rain blurred my view, but not enough to erase the image of them walking side by side. Driving home that evening, the silence in the car pressed against my ears. Every mile felt like a line I couldn't cross back over. The life I had believed, in the man I had trusted, the friend I had leaned on, they no longer existed in the same way. I carried the knowledge with me like a stone, heavy and immovable, lodged deep inside. When I returned, Lily was still out with friends, and the house greeted me with its familiar warmth. I set my purse down, moved through the kitchen, and touched the back of a chair just to steady myself. My reflection in the darkened window looked pale, almost hollow, but behind my eyes, something new burned. I was no longer guessing or doubting. I knew. And once you know the truth, you cannot return to blindness. The scarf, the perfume, the whispers, they had been pieces of a puzzle. Now I held the completed picture, and it was sharper, crueler than I had feared. But it also brought clarity, and clarity, I realized, was the beginning of strength. That night, lying awake while Mark slept soundly beside me, I stared into the darkness and whispered a vow only I could hear. This would not be the end of me. The pain I carried would be reshaped, tempered into something stronger. And soon, I would take my first step toward reclaiming the life and dignity they had tried to steal. I woke the next morning with my decision carved deep inside me. The night before had stripped away any illusions, and with them, my silence. The truth could no longer be ignored, and I was done being the passive partner who allowed betrayal to grow unchecked. My first steps had to be measured, careful, and invisible to Mark. If I confronted him too soon, he would twist the truth into something unrecognizable. But if I gathered what I needed quietly, he would have no way to deny it when the time came. I began with small changes he would never notice. Each evening after school, once Lily was settled with her homework, I walked the rooms of our home checking drawers and cabinets with calm hands and steady breath. I wasn't looking for something obvious. Affairs rarely left tidy evidence, but for details, little traces of a life lived in shadows. And there they were. A receipt folded into the pocket of his blazer marked with dinner for two at a restaurant I had never visited. A hotel keycard tucked in the lining of his briefcase, anonymous and blank, except for a magnetic strip. Each discovery felt like a pin driven deeper into my heart. But I kept my face composed, my movements deliberate. I slipped each item into a folder that I hid inside an old storage box in the garage. To steady myself, I reached for help outside the walls of our house. I called James Harper, an attorney in town I knew from years of counseling his niece at school. James was discreet, thoughtful, and respected. When I asked to meet privately, he didn't press me for reasons, only set an appointment in his office after hours. The evening I walked into his dimly lit conference room, I carried my folder under one arm, my palms damp despite the cool air. James listened without interruption as I laid out the fragments I had collected, his steady eyes fixed on mine. When I finished, he leaned forward, his voice calm. "Elena, what you have here is enough to open a door. If you want to step through it, I can help you plan where it leads." His words grounded me. I wasn't powerless. I had choices, and choices meant strength. That weekend, Mark claimed he had to fly to Chicago for 3 days. I kissed his cheek as he rolled his suitcase through the front door, my voice even and warm as I told him to travel safe. The moment his car disappeared down the street, I felt the weight lift, just enough to breathe. I picked up the phone and called Rachel Donovan, a private investigator James recommended. Rachel was practical and sharp, her tone brisk, but not unkind. We met the next morning at a quiet diner off the highway. She was older, perhaps in her late 50s, with steel gray hair pulled into a neat braid. I trusted her immediately. When I slid the folder across the booth, she scanned the contents quickly, then nodded. "You've already done more than most," she said. "I'll take it from here." Rachel's updates arrived like careful drops of water on stone, each one eroding the last fragments of doubt I clung to. Photos of Mark and Tessa walking arm in arm into hotels, time-stamped records of their meetings, even witness accounts of them leaving events together when they thought no one was watching. Each piece cut me, yet each piece also strengthened me. The betrayal was no longer whispers in my head or perfume on his collar. It was documented, real, undeniable. I kept my composure at home. Mark returned from his so-called trip with souvenirs for Lily and stories of long meetings. I smiled politely, even laughed at the right moments while Rachel's photographs sat hidden in the garage box. He never suspected a thing. If anything, he seemed more relaxed, more certain that his secret world was safe. That arrogance gave me room to breathe and plan. In the quiet evenings after Lily had gone upstairs, I sat with a notebook in my lap, sketching out the lines of my future. The house, our finances, Lily's college savings. I studied every corner of the life we had built, deciding what I would protect and what I was willing to leave behind. Each decision was heavy, but with every page I filled, the weight on my chest grew lighter. I was no longer drifting through nights of doubt and tears. I was building a path forward, one steady step at a time. The first real test of my resolve came at dinner with Walter, my father-in-law. He had invited us to his house for a Sunday meal, a tradition he kept since his wife's passing. Mark was restless that evening, his phone buzzing in his pocket, while Walter carved the roast with steady hands. At one point, Walter looked directly at me, his eyes sharp beneath the years. "You're too quiet tonight, Elena," he said. "Is everything all right?" My throat tightened, but I only smiled and replied, I'm fine, just a little tired. He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, though I felt his gaze linger even as the conversation moved on. Part of me wondered if he saw more than I allowed him to. When we returned home, Mark left again, almost immediately muttering about meeting a client. As his car pulled away, I stood at the window, my reflection staring back in the darkened glass. For the first time, I didn't feel like a woman abandoned. I felt like a woman preparing. Every late return, every excuse, every secret message only added to the weight he would soon have to carry. That night, I returned to the garage, sliding open the storage box. Inside, the folder had grown thicker, filled with receipts, key cards, photographs, and records. I traced my hand across the cover, steadying myself with its cold truth. These weren't just scraps of evidence. They were pieces of my freedom. I closed the box gently and whispered to the silence. Not yet, but soon. My voice did not tremble. For the first time in months, it carried certainty. Because the time for silent suffering was ending, and the first steps of my quiet revenge had already begun. And though Mark slept peacefully under the same roof, dreaming of a life built on lies, he had no idea that the balance of power was shifting quietly in the dark. The night of Walter's birthday gathering was the moment I chose to let the truth breathe in daylight. He had asked for a simple dinner with family and a few close friends. Nothing extravagant, but everyone showed up. Neighbors, old co-workers, even some of the men he once built houses beside. The living room glowed with warm light, the smell of roast beef drifting in from the kitchen. Laughter rose easily, but beneath it I carried the quiet weight of what I was about to do. Mark stood near the bar cart, his hand loosely wrapped around a glass of bourbon, playing the role of the attentive son. Tessa had arrived early, slipping in with her usual effortless charm, cheeks brushed with color, smile practiced. She hovered too close to him, her hand brushing his arm, as though she had every right. I stayed calm, my dress pressed my hair neat, the folder Rachel had assembled, tucked safely into my purse. Dinner began, as it always did. Walter led Grace, his voice steady despite the years. Lily sat beside me, twirling her fork through her potatoes, unaware of the storm about to break. Mark spoke in polished tones about sales projections and new clients, while Tessa chimed in with tales of her event business. It was almost unbearable to hear them weaving lies so smoothly while seated across from me. My heart thudded, but my face never revealed it. Halfway through dessert, I set my fork down and folded my hands in my lap. There's something I need to say. I began softly, my voice clear but calm. Conversation stilled, heads turned, and even Mark's glass froze halfway to his lips. I glanced at Walter, whose eyes narrowed slightly as if he sensed what was coming. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, I continued. Family means everything, and honesty matters most of all. Which is why I can't keep pretending I don't know the truth. I reached into my purse and pulled out the folder, sliding a photograph across the table. Mark's hand twitched. Tessa's face drained of color. The photo was simple, just the two of them walking into a hotel side by side, time stamped clearly in the corner. Gasps rippled quietly through the table. I didn't raise my voice or point a finger. Instead, I laid out the evidence with measured precision: receipts, keycards, records of meetings disguised as business. Each piece landed like a stone, undeniable and final. Mark stammered. "This is out of context. You don't understand." His voice cracked, the polish gone. Tessa shifted in her chair, her hands clutching her napkin until it tore. But the more they fumbled, the clearer their betrayal became. Walter's fork clattered against his plate, his jaw tight. "Mark," he said firmly, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had built his life with his hands. "Tell me, this isn't what it looks like." Silence followed. Mark's eyes dropped to the table, his lips pressed into a thin line. He had no defense left. The room shifted. Friends who had once admired us sat back and stunned, quiet neighbors exchanged glances, and Lily's breath caught softly beside me. I placed a steady hand over hers, squeezing gently, offering her the strength she needed to sit through the storm. I didn't cry or shout. I let the silence itself serve as witness to what had been hidden for too long. When I finally spoke again, my voice carried no tremor. You wanted to build your life in shadows, Mark. Tonight, the light found you. Tessa rose quickly, muttering something about needing air, but no one followed her. Mark tried to stand as well, but Walter's sharp voice cut through the room. Sit down, he commanded. The authority in his tone left no room for escape. Mark sank back into his chair, his face pale, his shoulders slumped. I gathered the folder, tucking it neatly back into my purse. The evidence had done its work. Nothing else needed to be said. I rose slowly, thanking Walter for the meal, kissing his cheek gently before turning to Lily. Come on, sweetheart, I murmured. She stood with me, her chin lifted, her hand holding tightly to mine. Together we walked out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage behind us. The drive home was quiet, the hum of the tires against the road steadying me. Lily finally spoke, her voice small but firm. Mom, I knew something was wrong. I'm glad you didn't let him keep lying. Her words, though painful, filled me with a strange relief. She had seen more than I realized, and now the truth had set us both free. That night, while Mark remained at his father's house, I moved through our home with quiet resolve. I opened the storage box in the garage, pulling out the notebook where I had mapped every step. The confrontation had been only the beginning. The fallout, I knew, would be sharper, louder, and far more public than anything he imagined. As I placed the folder back inside, I whispered to myself, It's done. The first battle had been fought, but the war for my dignity was only beginning. Mark's world had cracked open in front of everyone who mattered most, and from here, there would be no repairing it. The house was still when I finally slipped into bed, the space beside me, empty, cool, against my arm. For the first time in months, I felt sleep approach, not with dread, but with clarity. I had faced the storm, and now the winds were shifting in my favor. Yet I knew the days ahead would not be easy. Betrayal never ended cleanly, and pride rarely surrendered without a fight. Mark would struggle, he would twist, and he would rage, but the truth had already escaped, and nothing could put it back into the dark. I closed my eyes, steady and certain. Tomorrow, the true collapse of his kingdom would begin. The morning after Walter's birthday dinner, the calls began. My phone lit up again and again, with Mark's number, each ring dragging through the house like a low siren. I didn't answer. When the messages came, they shifted from pleading to angry in the space of a few hours. We can talk this out. You've embarrassed me in front of everyone. If you think you're walking away with Lily and the house, you're dreaming. His words spilled with the desperation of a man who realized the ground beneath him was gone. By evening, he appeared on the front porch. Through the glass of the door, I saw his hair unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes rimmed red. He knocked once, then again, louder, until his fist pounded against the wood. Lily stood at the top of the stairs, frozen in the shadows. I raised my hand, signaling her to stay back, then opened the door just enough to meet his eyes. Elena. Please, he said, voice breaking. You've turned everyone against me. My father won't return my calls. The neighbors, do you know what they're saying? His hand pressed against the doorframe, fingers trembling. I kept my voice even. You did this to yourself, Mark. I only showed the truth. He shook his head violently, stepping closer, but I braced the door, not letting him in. You've ruined everything. Tessa won't even answer me. Do you understand? She left me standing in the parking lot like a fool. His words spilled faster now, unraveling. You've taken everything from me. For the first time, I felt no fear, only clarity. No, Mark. You gave it away. I closed the door firmly, sliding the deadbolt into place, while his voice cracked outside. He stayed for a few minutes longer, his words rising into curses before the night finally swallowed his footsteps down the walk. The days that followed revealed the wreckage he had left behind. Walter came to the house one afternoon, his expression solemn but kind. He sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, shaking his head slowly. I raised him better than this, he murmured, but you don't need to carry his shame. His words steadied me. For the first time, I felt the family name no longer tethered me to his failures. Tessa's downfall arrived quietly but swiftly. Word spread through town about her involvement with Mark, and clients began to cancel contracts one after another. I heard from a neighbor that she'd been seen boxing up her office late at night, slipping away before anyone could confront her. Her once bustling calendar of events had emptied, and with it, the image she'd spent years crafting. Mark, stripped of both his affair and his family's respect, unraveled in public. He stormed through work meetings, lashing out at colleagues until his company placed him on leave. Old friends stopped answering his calls. The more he tried to spin the story in his favor, the more people pulled away. At the grocery store, I overheard whispers, women shaking their heads, men muttering about disappointment. His charm, once his greatest weapon, no longer held weight. Lily watched it all with wide eyes, quiet but observant. One evening, as I tucked a blanket around her shoulders on the couch, she asked softly, "Do we have to see him again?" I brushed her hair back gently, my chest aching at her innocence. "Not unless you want to," I assured her. She nodded, relief flooding her features, and leaned into me. That moment sealed what I already knew: I had to protect her from any further damage. Rachel delivered the final set of documents, neatly organized, each page a nail in the coffin of his deception. Legal records, financial accounts, hotel logs. It was all there, impossible to deny. With James's guidance, I filed quietly for separation, the paperwork moving forward with steady force. There was no drama left to perform. The truth itself had become the stage. The ripple effects spread further than I imagined. A neighbor stopped me on the sidewalk one morning, pressing my hand gently. "You deserved better, Elena." We all saw the way he carried on. "I'm glad you stood up for yourself." Her words lingered, a reminder that what had once felt like private shame had become a story others carried too. Mark attempted one final performance. He arrived unannounced at Walter's house during a Sunday dinner, demanding to be heard. Walter told me later that he had listened in silence as Mark shouted about betrayal, about me poisoning his life. When he finally stopped, Walter's reply was sharp and final. "You betrayed yourself, son. Don't lay that at her feet." It was then that Mark's world truly collapsed. Cut off from Tessa, isolated from his family, shamed by the community, he became a man adrift with no anchor left to hold him. For me, the change was quieter but deeper. I moved through the house with a sense of calm I hadn't felt in years. Each drawer I opened, each room I tidied, no longer carried the sting of suspicion. I was not living under his shadow anymore. But I knew the hardest step was still ahead. The truth was exposed, justice had begun its work, but closure had not yet arrived. I would need to face him one last time, not in anger, but in finality, to reclaim the dignity he had tried to strip from me. And when that moment came, I promised myself I would not waver. The last time I saw Mark was not in a courtroom or at a family gathering, but in a quiet conference room with James seated beside me. He looked smaller than I remembered. His suit wrinkled, his eyes dull with fatigue. The man who once carried himself with polished charm now shifted in his chair, unable to meet my gaze. Papers lay spread across the table, each one carrying the weight of decisions I had already made. There were no shouts, no grand gestures, just the sound of a pen scratching against the page as he signed away what he had once taken for granted. Walter had joined us earlier that day, steady as always, placing a hand on my shoulder before the meeting began. "You've done what needed to be done," he told me softly. "Don't doubt yourself now." His support meant more than I could say. Though this wasn't his burden to carry, he stood firmly on the side of truth, a reminder that loyalty, when real, is quiet but unshakable. When it was over, I walked out of the building with the late afternoon sun on my face. The air felt lighter, sharper, as though I could finally breathe without the weight pressing against my chest. Lily was waiting at home, her textbooks scattered across the dining room table, and when she looked up at me, I saw relief in her eyes. She didn't ask for details. She only stood and wrapped her arms around me. That embrace told me everything I had protected her, and she knew it. In the weeks that followed, Mark tried once or twice to reach out, his words scribbled in notes left on the porch. I didn't answer. Each envelope stayed sealed before I dropped it into the shredder. His apologies came too late, and they weren't mine to carry. Tessa disappeared from our circle completely, her business folding quietly, her name mentioned only in whispers around town. I let her fade without bitterness. Some people remove themselves from your life, and that too is a kind of gift. Slowly, our home began to feel like ours again. The quiet no longer pressed down on me, but settled warmly, filled with the small sounds of ordinary life. Lily's laughter drifting from her room, the kettle whistling in the kitchen, the creak of the porch swing in the evening breeze. I started tending the garden again, pulling weeds, planting new bulbs, watching green shoots push through the soil. It was a small act, but it reminded me that life continues and healing often begins in quiet, steady ways. Looking back, I realized the greatest shift was not in Mark's downfall, but in my own strength. I had faced betrayal from both a husband and a friend, yet I had not let it define me. Instead, I gathered the pieces, chose my steps carefully, and stood tall when the time came to speak. Justice was never about revenge. In the loud sense, it was about reclaiming my dignity, about showing Lily that silence in the face of betrayal is not strength, but truth spoken calmly is. There are moments I still feel the ache of it late at night when the house is still. But even in those moments, I remind myself of what remains honesty, family, and the resilience to begin again. Love, when real, does not demand proof or hide in shadows. It shows itself in constancy, in care, in the courage to stand beside someone without conditions. So now, when I sit on the porch, watching the sun dip low behind the trees, I feel peace. Not because everything turned out as I once imagined, but because I walked through the storm and came out whole. Lily and I have built something steady, rooted in truth, and no betrayal can take that from us. Before we close, I'd love to know which part of this journey spoke most deeply to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to hear more true family stories, stay connected here.